The rain tapped softly against the window pane, a rhythmic patter that seemed to echo the restless thoughts swirling in my mind. I sat at the small cafe table, staring into my coffee as if it held answers to questions I wasn't sure how to ask. It had been one of those days, a day where everything felt heavier than it should have, like carrying an invisible weight no one else could see. My phone buzzed on the table, but I ignored it. Work emails, probably. Or maybe another message from mom asking when I'd come home for dinner again. Either way, I didn't feel up to responding that I sighed and leaned back in my chair, letting my gaze drift across the room. The cafe was warm and cozy, its walls lined with shelves of books and mismatched furniture that gave it a lived-in charm. A group of college students laughed loudly near the counter, their carefree energy a stark contrast to the quiet storm brewing inside me. I envied them, just for a moment, their ease, their certainty about who they were and what they wanted. But then there was him. He stood by the pastry display, his fingers brushing absently over the edge of his scarf as he scanned the menu above the counter. There was something about the way he carried himself, confident yet understated, commanding attention without even trying, that made my chest tighten. He wore a dark coat that hugged his frame perfectly, its fabric catching the soft glow of the overhead lights. His hair was damp from the rain, curling slightly at the ends, and his profile was sharp enough to make me catch my breath. I shouldn't have been looking. I knew better. Growing up in a household steeped in religion, I'd learned early on what was expected of me. Marry someone nice, settle down, live a normal life. Anything outside of that script was labeled wrong, sinful, shameful. And yet, here I was, unable to tear my eyes away from this stranger who exuded a kind of magnetism I couldn't explain. When he finally turned toward me, our eyes met briefly, and my heart skipped a beat. His gaze lingered for only a second before he looked away, but it was long enough to leave an impression. Something flickered in his expression. Curiosity? Recognition? Whatever it was, it sent a jolt through me, leaving me both exhilarated and uneasy. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not now, not ever. I'd spent years burying these feelings, convincing myself they were nothing more than fleeting impulses I could ignore. But seeing him standing there, so effortlessly captivating, made all those carefully constructed walls waver. For a brief, terrifying moment, I wondered what it would be like to let go, to stop fighting against something that felt so undeniably real. And then he smiled that tea wasn't directed at me, not really. He was talking to the barista behind the counter, thanking her for his order with a warmth that lit up his entire face. Still, that smile hit me like a punch to the gut. It was genuine, unguarded, the kind of smile that made you believe, for just a second, that the world might actually be okay. That maybe you could be okay too. I shook my head, forcing myself to look away. This was dangerous territory, and I knew it. My father's voice echoed in my mind, stern and unyielding, reminding me of all the reasons I needed to stay far away from anything or anyone that threatened to disrupt the life I was supposed to lead. Stay away from sin, he'd always said. Keep your focus on what matters. But what if what mattered most wasn't what everyone else told me it should be? As the man walked past my table, our shoulders nearly brushed. He smelled faintly of cologne and rain, a combination that lingered in the air even after he was gone. I watched him leave, clutching his coffee cup tightly as he pushed open the door and disappeared into the gray afternoon. For a while, I just sat there, staring at the empty doorway. Part of me wanted to chase after him, to find out who he was and why he'd left such an indelible mark on me in such a short amount of time. But the other part, the rational, cautious part, knew better. Knew that some doors were better left closed, or so I thought. Because later that evening, as I scrolled absent-mindedly through social media, a notification popped up on my screen. Someone had tagged me in a photo taken earlier that day, at the cafe. My stomach dropped as I clicked on it, only to find a candid shot of me sitting alone at my table, lost in thought. The caption read, "Caught this guy deep in contemplation today. Anyone know him?" And beneath it, in the comments section, was a single reply from none other than the man with the unforgettable smile. Looks like someone worth getting to know. My hands trembled as I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. How had he found me? Why had he reached out? Questions tumbled over each other in my mind. But one thing was certain. This was the beginning of something I hadn't anticipated. Something that would challenge everything I thought I knew about love, faith, and myself. Little did I know, this chance encounter would set off a chain reaction neither of us could have predicted, one that would test the boundaries of belief, redefine the meaning of connection, and force us both to confront the truths we'd buried deep within ourselves. The notification burned in my mind like a brand, searing its way into every thought I tried to push aside. His comment, casual, almost teasing, felt like an invitation and a dare all at once. Looks like someone worth getting to know. Worth getting to know. The words looped endlessly in my head, each repetition pulling me closer to the edge of something I wasn't sure I was ready for. That I stared at the screen for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. My thumb hovered over the reply button, trembling slightly as if it had a will of its own. What did I even say? Thanks for noticing me. Sorry, I don't do this. Or worse, nothing at all. Ignoring him would be easier, safer. But ignoring him also meant ignoring the strange pull I'd felt since our eyes met earlier that day. Before I could second-guess myself further, I typed out a response. Guess you caught me on a deep thinking day. Thanks for the tag. I'm protagonist's name. It was simple, neutral, non-committal, safe. And yet, hitting send felt like stepping off a cliff. His reply came faster than I expected. Nice to officially meet you, protagonist's name. I'm Ezra. Deep thoughts suit you. Ezra. The name rolled around in my mind, unfamiliar, yet fitting somehow. It suited him. The confidence, the quiet charm, the way he seemed unbothered by boundaries most people instinctively respected. We exchanged a few more messages that night. Nothing too personal, just light banter about the cafe and the weather. Still, there was an undercurrent to his words, a subtle curiosity that made my skin prickle. By the time we signed off with vague promises to talk soon, I was both exhilarated and terrified. Sleep eluded me that night. Instead, I lay awake replaying our conversation, dissecting every word, every punctuation mark, searching for hidden meanings where there might have been none. The next morning, I woke up groggy and irritable, the weight of my late night overthinking pressing down on me. As I shuffled into the kitchen to make coffee, my phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't a message, it was a call from Ezra. My heart leapt into my throat. What did he want? Why was he calling? Wasn't texting supposed to be safer? Safer for whom, though? For him or for me? Against my better judgment, I answered. Morning. His voice greeted me, smooth and warm like honey. Hope I didn't wake you. No. I lied, clutching the phone tighter. Just making coffee. Good timing then. Mind if I join you? Virtually, I mean. I laughed nervously, unsure how to respond. He sounded so casual, so at ease while I was anything but. Sure, I said finally, settling onto the couch with my mug. For the next 20 minutes, we talked. Or rather, he talked, and I listened. He told me about his job as a graphic designer, his love for photography, his habit of visiting random cafes to people watch. His enthusiasm was infectious, his stories vivid enough to paint pictures in my mind. Slowly, tentatively, I started sharing bits of myself too. My work, my hobbies, the books I liked to read when I needed an escape. By the end of the call, I realized two things. First, Ezra had a way of making you feel seen without ever being intrusive. Second, I wanted to see him again. Not through a screen, not in passing, but face to face. Our first real meeting happened 3 days later, entirely by accident, or so it seemed. I was running errands downtown when I spotted him across the street, leaning against a lamppost with a sketch pad in hand. He looked different today, more relaxed, dressed in jeans and a leather jacket that hugged his shoulders just right. My steps faltered, torn between crossing the street to say hello and turning around to avoid the inevitable awkwardness. But before I could decide, he looked up and saw me. Protagonist's name, he called out, waving enthusiastically. There was no escaping now. I crossed the street, trying to act natural despite the butterflies rioting in my stomach. Hey, I said, stopping a few feet away. Fancy seeing you here. Funny how that happens, isn't it? he replied with a grin. Mind if I walk with you? I could use a break from drawing. And just like that, we fell in a step together, navigating the crowded sidewalks as if it were the most natural thing in the world. We talked about everything and nothing. Our favorite movies, childhood memories, the absurdity of small talk with strangers. With each passing minute, the tension inside me eased, replaced by a warmth I hadn't realized I'd been craving at T1 point. We stopped at a park bench overlooking a small pond. Ducks paddled lazily in the water, their reflections rippling in the sunlight. Ezra pulled out his sketch pad and began doodling absent-mindedly, glancing up at me every so often. You're easy to draw, he said after a while, tilting the pad toward me that I blinked in surprise. The sketch was rough but unmistakably me. My posture, my expression, even the faint crease between my eyebrows that appeared whenever I was deep in thought. It's good, I stammered, feeling oddly exposed. He chuckled softly. Don't worry, I won't sell it online or anything. Unless you want me to. I shook my head, laughing despite myself. No thanks. One viral moment is enough for me. His smile softened, turning thoughtful. You know, you seem different in person. More guarded, maybe. Like you're holding something back. His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Guarded. That was exactly what I'd always been. How could he see that so clearly when I worked so hard to hide it? I guess I am, I admitted quietly, staring at the pond. It's complicated. He didn't press me for details, didn't demand explanations. Instead, he simply nodded, as if he understood more than he let on. Well, he said after a pause, if you ever feel like talking about it, I'm a pretty good listener. His offer hung in the air, gentle yet loaded with possibility. For the first time in years, I considered taking someone up on it. That evening, as I walked home, I couldn't stop thinking about him, about the way he looked at me, not with pity or judgment, but with genuine interest, about the way he made me feel like I could breathe a little easier just by being near him. But alongside those feelings came the familiar weight of doubt and fear. What was I doing? Letting myself get close to someone like this. It was reckless, irresponsible. My father's voice echoed louder than ever, warning me of the consequences of straying from the path I was supposed to follow. And yet, for the first time, I wondered, what if the path I was supposed to follow wasn't the right one for me? Over the next few weeks, Ezra became a constant presence in my life, subtle but undeniable, like the first light of dawn creeping through heavy curtains. It wasn't anything dramatic or overt. It was smaller moments that wove themselves into the fabric of my days. A text in the morning asking how I'd slept. A voice note sent during his lunch break, filled with snippets of music he thought I'd like. An invitation to meet up just because. Each interaction felt like another thread pulling me closer to him, even as part of me resisted point one Friday evening. After a particularly grueling week at work, I found myself sitting on a park bench near the pond where we'd met before. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of fallen leaves and damp earth. I hadn't planned to come here. It just happened, as if some invisible force had guided me back to this spot. And then, almost as if he'd been waiting for me, Ezra appeared. Hey, he said softly, sliding onto the bench beside me. His jacket smelled faintly of cedarwood, a comforting contrast to the cool autumn breeze. You knew I'd be here. I accused lightly, though there was no real accusation in my tone. He grinned, unapologetic. Maybe, or maybe I just got lucky. We sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the sun dip lower in the sky. Its golden rays stretched across the water, turning the surface into liquid fire. The world seemed quieter here, softer, as if the chaos of everyday life couldn't reach us. You look tired, Ezra said eventually, his voice low and concerned. I admitted, leaning back against the bench. It's been a lot lately. He didn't ask me to elaborate, didn't push for details. Instead, he reached out and brushed a stray leaf from my shoulder, his fingers lingering just a fraction longer than necessary. The touch was fleeting, barely noticeable, but it sent a shiver down my spine. You don't have to carry everything alone, you know, he murmured. His words struck a chord deep within me, resonating with a truth I'd spent years trying to ignore. How many times had I told myself I could handle it all on my own. That asking for help or letting someone in was a sign of weakness. But sitting here with Ezra, feeling the warmth radiating off him, I wondered if maybe I'd been wrong. The following weekend, Ezra invited me to join him on one of his photography outings. I'm heading to this old bookstore downtown, he explained over the phone. They've got these massive windows that catch the light perfectly. Thought you might enjoy it. I hesitated. Bookstores weren't exactly my usual scene, especially not ones that doubled as photo ops. But something about the way he said it, with genuine excitement, as if sharing this little piece of himself with me, made it impossible to refuse. When I arrived, he was already there, camera slung around his neck and a wide grin splitting his face. "You made it," he exclaimed, waving me over. The bookstore was unlike any I'd ever seen. Towering shelves lined the walls, crammed with books of every genre imaginable. Sunlight streamed through the enormous windows, casting long shadows across the wooden floors. The air smelled faintly of paper and ink, mingling with the faint aroma of coffee from a small cafe tucked in the corner. "This place is incredible," I breathed, taking it all in. "Right?" Ezra said, snapping a quick shot of me as I turned to face him. "Wait till you see the second floor. There's a reading nook with the best view." We wandered through the aisles together, our shoulders brushing occasionally as we moved. He pointed out books he loved, authors he admired, stories that had stayed with him long after he'd finished reading them. Listening to him talk, I realized how much passion he poured into everything he did. It was intoxicating, infectious, making me want to share pieces of myself too. At one point, I picked up a worn copy of The Great Gatsby and flipped through its pages. "This was my mom's favorite book," I said without thinking. Ezra tilted his head, intrigued. "What about yours?" I hesitated, running my thumb along the edge of the cover. "I don't know. Maybe To Kill a Mockingbird? Something about Atticus Finch always stuck with me." "That makes sense," he said thoughtfully. "You strike me as someone who believes in doing the right thing, even when it's hard." His observation caught me off guard. No one had ever described me that way before, at least not so accurately. "Yeah," I said quietly. "Something like that." Later, we climbed the narrow staircase to the second floor. True to his word, the reading nook was breathtaking. A large window framed the city skyline, bathed in the soft glow of late afternoon sunlight. Ezra set up his tripod and began adjusting his camera settings, humming softly under his breath. I settled into the cozy armchair tucked beneath the window, watching him work. There was something mesmerizing about the way he moved, focused yet unhurried, completely absorbed in the moment. Every now and then, he'd glance up and catch me staring, flashing me a quick smile before returning to his task. After a while, he joined me in the chair, squeezing in close despite the limited space. Our knees bumped, and I shifted awkwardly, suddenly hyper-aware of how near he was. "So," he said, tilting his head toward me. "What's your story?" "My story," I echoed, stalling for time. "Yeah. Like, why are you the way you are? What makes you tick?" The question hung between us, loaded with possibility. For a moment, I considered deflecting, steering the conversation towards safer topics. But something in his gaze, the earnestness, the openness, made me pause. I guess I started slowly, choosing my words carefully. "I grew up in a pretty strict household. My dad's a pastor, so religion was kind of everything. Rules, expectations, all that. I never really fit into the mold they wanted me to, but I tried anyway. Kept my head down, followed the script." Ezra nodded, encouraging me to continue. But lately, I trailed off, struggling to put my thoughts into words. Lately, I've been wondering if the script was ever meant for me. If maybe I deserved to write my own. His hand found mine, resting gently on top of it. The contact was warm, grounding, chasing away the chill of uncertainty that had settled in my chest. "I think you do," he said simply. "And whoever you decide to be, I'll still be here." Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, unexpected and unwelcome. I blinked them away quickly, embarrassed by the sudden swell of emotion. "Thank you," I whispered, my voice barely audible. "For what?" "For seeing me." That night, as we walked home together under a canopy of stars, I allowed myself to imagine, for just a moment, what it might feel like to let go, to stop fighting against the pull I felt toward him, toward the person I could become if I stopped being afraid. But fear has a way of clinging to you, whispering doubts in your ear, even when you try to drown it out. As we parted ways outside my apartment building, Ezra leaned in and pressed a soft kiss to my cheek. It was chaste, innocent, yet it left me reeling. "Good night, protagonist's name," he said, his breath warm against my skin. "Good night," I replied, watching him walk away until he disappeared into the night. Back inside, I stood by the window, staring out at the empty street below. My heart ached with longing and hesitation, torn between the life I'd always known and the one I was beginning to dream of. The days that followed our bookstore outing were a blur of stolen glances and lingering touches, each interaction charged with an unspoken tension that neither of us seemed willing, or perhaps able, to address. Ezra continued to weave himself into the fabric of my life in ways both subtle and profound. A shared meal here, a quiet walk there. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle slowly coming together, though I wasn't sure what the final picture would look like. And then came the storm IT rolled in unexpectedly one Friday evening, dark clouds swallowing the horizon as lightning split the sky in jagged streaks. I had planned to spend the night alone, curled up on the couch with a book, but Ezra's text arrived just as the first drops began to fall. "Rainy nights are better with company. Want you to come over?" My heart raced at the suggestion. Having him here, in my space where walls couldn't shield me, felt dangerous, intimate. But before I could second-guess myself, I replied, "Sure." When he arrived, soaked from the downpour despite his umbrella, I handed him a towel and ushered him inside. The air between us was electric, crackling with something neither of us dared name aloud. We settled onto the couch, close enough that our knees brushed occasionally, the sound of rain tapping against the windows filling the silence. "This weather is insane," Ezra said, running a hand through his damp hair. His shirt clung to him slightly, outlining the curve of his shoulders, and I forced myself to look away. "It's cozy," I countered, though my voice betrayed a slight tremor. "Kind of perfect for staying in." He turned to face me, his expression softening. "Perfect for talking to, maybe?" I froze, caught off guard by the directness of his tone. "Talking about what?" "About whatever it is you've been holding back," he said gently. "You don't have to tell me everything tonight, but I think it's time we stop dancing around this." His words hit me like a thunderclap, echoing the truth I'd been avoiding. My throat tightened, panic rising in my chest. How could I explain something I barely understood myself? How could I put into words the war raging inside me? The guilt, the longing, the fear? "I don't know if I can," I admitted finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "You don't have to do it alone," he murmured, reaching out to take my hand. His touch was warm, grounding, yet it sent a jolt through me all the same. "Let me help you." For a moment, I considered pulling away, retreating behind the walls I'd built so carefully. But something in his gaze, a mix of patience and determination, held me captive. Slowly, haltingly, I began to speak. "I've spent my whole life trying to be someone I'm not," I confessed, staring down at our intertwined hands. "Trying to fit into a mold that never felt right. And now, I feel like I'm standing at the edge of something huge, something terrifying. Like if I take one step forward, there's no going back." Ezra didn't interrupt, didn't try to fix things with empty reassurances. He simply listened, his thumb tracing slow circles on the back of my hand. When I finally looked up at him, his eyes were filled with understanding, and something else, something deeper. "What are you afraid of?" he asked softly. "Everything," I said, my voice breaking. "My family, my faith, losing myself completely. Losing you." The last part slipped out before I could stop it, raw and unfiltered. Ezra's breath hitched, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. Then, without warning, he leaned in, closing the distance between us. The kiss was hesitant at first, almost questioning, as if he was giving me the chance to pull away. But when I didn't, when I leaned into him instead, my lips parting beneath his, it deepened, becoming something more urgent, more desperate. His fingers tangled in my hair, pulling me closer, while mine clutched his shirt, needing to anchor myself to something solid. Time seemed to stop. The rain outside faded into white noise, the world narrowing to just the two of us, suspended in this fragile, beautiful moment. It wasn't perfect, there was awkwardness, uncertainty, but it was real, achingly so. And in that moment, I felt seen in a way I never had before. When we finally pulled apart, breathless and trembling, Ezra rested his forehead against mine. "You're not going to lose me," he promised, his voice rough with emotion. "Not unless you push me away." Tears spilled down my cheeks, unchecked and unbidden. "I don't want to push you away," I whispered, "but I'm scared of what happens next." "So am I," he admitted, brushing a tear from my cheek with his thumb. "But we'll figure it out. Together." The rest of the night passed in a haze of whispered conversations and tentative touches, each moment building on the last. We talked about everything: our fears, our hopes, the futures we wanted but weren't sure how to reach. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a life where I didn't have to hide, where I could be fully, unapologetically myself. But even as the storm outside began to subside, leaving only the gentle patter of rain in its wake, I knew the hardest battles were still ahead. Coming out to my family, reconciling my faith with who I was, it wouldn't be easy. There would be pain, rejection, moments where I'd question whether I was strong enough to keep going. Yet as I lay in bed later that night, listening to Ezra's steady breathing beside me, I realized something important. I didn't have to face it alone anymore. Whatever challenges lay ahead, I had someone who believed in me, who saw me for who I truly was, and loved me anyway. The morning after the storm arrived with a deceptive calm, sunlight streaming through the cracks in my blinds as if nothing monumental had shifted. But everything had changed. The weight of what happened pressed heavily on my chest, a mix of exhilaration and dread that made it hard to breathe. Ezra was still asleep on the couch where we'd talked late into the night, his face peaceful, his breathing steady. Watching him, I felt a pang of guilt, not for what we'd shared, but for the chaos I knew would follow once the world outside intruded again. I slipped out of bed quietly, pulling on a hoodie before stepping onto the balcony. The air smelled fresh, cleansed by the rain, but the quiet only amplified the noise in my head. My father's voice echoed louder than ever now, stern and unyielding. "Stay away from sin." What would he say if he knew about Ezra? About us? Would he see this as proof that I'd strayed too far, that I was beyond saving? My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. It was a text from my mom. "Haven't heard from you in a while. Everything okay?" A lump formed in my throat. How could I possibly answer that question when I didn't even know myself? Instead, I typed out a vague response. "Just been busy with work. Love you." Before I could overthink it further, another notification popped up, a missed call from my sister, followed by a voicemail. Her tone was clipped, urgent. "Hey, Mom said you haven't been answering her calls. Dad wants everyone home for dinner tonight. Something important to discuss. Call me back." Something important. Those two words sent a chill down my spine. Important usually meant bad news, or worse, an intervention. I stared at the message for a long time, trying to decide whether to ignore it or face whatever was coming head on. Ezra stirred behind me, his voice groggy but warm. "Morning." I turned to find him sitting up, rubbing sleep from his eyes. For a moment, I forgot about the text, about my family, about everything except the way he looked at me like I was the center of his universe. "Hey," I said softly, forcing a smile. "Sleep well." He nodded, stretching lazily. "Better than I have in weeks." "You?" I hesitated, then shook my head. "Not really." His expression softened, concern flickering across his features. "What's wrong?" "My dad. He wants me to come home for dinner tonight. Says it's important." Ezra frowned, clearly sensing the unease in my voice. "Do you think it's about us?" "I don't know," I admitted, running a hand through my hair. "Maybe. Or maybe it's just some random thing. Either way, I can't avoid it forever." "You're not alone in this," he reminded me gently. "Whatever happens, I'm here." His reassurance should have comforted me, but instead, it only heightened my anxiety. What if being here wasn't enough? What if loving him, and letting myself be loved, wasn't enough to shield me from the fallout? Dinner at my parents' house was always a formal affair, complete with candles on the table and prayers before meals. Tonight, however, the atmosphere felt heavier, charged with an undercurrent of tension I couldn't quite place. My father sat at the head of the table, his Bible open beside him, while my mother bustled around the kitchen, pretending not to notice the awkward silence. My sister shot me a sympathetic glance, though she seemed just as uneasy as I was. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "We need to talk about something serious." "Here it comes," I thought, bracing myself. "There's been gossip," he continued, his voice low and measured, "about your behavior lately. People are saying things that reflect poorly on our family." My stomach dropped. Gossip, of course. In a small community like ours, whispers traveled faster than wildfire. Someone must have seen Ezra and me together, pieced things together, and decided to spread rumors. "What kind of things?" I asked, my voice steadier than I expected, and why father's gaze hardened. "Things that suggest you've been associating with someone inappropriate, someone who doesn't share our values." The room seemed to shrink around me, the walls closing in. My mother placed a hand on my father's arm, attempting to intervene. "Maybe we should hear protagonist's name, as side of the story first." "No," my father interrupted sharply. "This isn't about excuses. This is about accountability. If you've done something wrong, you need to repent. For your sake, and for the sake of this family. Repent." The word hit me like a slap, sharp and stinging. Repent for what? For wanting to be happy? For daring to love someone who saw me for who I truly was? "I haven't done anything wrong," I said firmly, surprising even myself with the conviction in my voice. "I'm not ashamed of who I am." The table fell silent, the weight of my declaration hanging heavy in the air. My father's jaw tightened, his knuckles white as he gripped the edge of the table. "Then perhaps you've forgotten what it means to honor God, to honor this family. And perhaps you've forgotten what it means to love unconditionally." I shot back, anger bubbling to the surface. "Because if you really cared about me, if you truly believed in forgiveness, you wouldn't be so quick to judge." My mother gasped, tears welling in her eyes, while my sister reached out to squeeze my hand onto the table. My father, however, remained unmoved, his expression cold and resolute. "This conversation is over," he said finally, standing abruptly. "If you choose this path, don't expect us to stand by you." With that, he left the room, leaving the rest of us sitting in stunned silence. My mother hurried after him, pleading softly, while my sister stayed behind, her eyes filled with sorrow. "I'm sorry," she whispered, hugging me tightly. "I wish there was something I could do." "It's not your fault," I murmured, though the ache in my chest told me otherwise that night. I called Ezra, needing to hear his voice more than anything. He answered immediately, his tone laced with worry. "How did it go?" he asked. "It was bad," I admitted, sinking onto the edge of my bed. "He basically disowned me." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I'm so sorry. I never wanted this for you." "It's not your fault," I said quickly, though part of me wondered if it was true. "Was any of this worth the cost?" "Yes, it is," Ezra replied, his voice breaking slightly. "You're losing everything because of me." "No," I insisted, gripping the phone tighter. "Because of them. Because they refuse to see me for who I am. And yeah, it hurts. It hurts so much. But I can't keep living a lie, Ezra. Not anymore." He exhaled shakily. "What happens now?" "I don't know," I confessed. "But I do know one thing. I'm not giving up on us. No matter what." For a moment, neither of us spoke, the enormity of my decision settling between us. Then, softly, Ezra said, "Neither am I." In the days that followed, the fallout rippled outward. Friends stopped calling. Church members avoided eye contact when I passed them on the street. Even my mother struggled to reconcile her faith with her love for me, torn between loyalty to my father and her desire to support her child. Yet amidst the pain, there were moments of light. Ezra became my anchor, holding me steady when the waves threatened to pull me under. We spent hours talking about the future, dreaming of a life where we could exist freely, without fear of judgment. But questions lingered, unanswered and unsettling. Could we really build a life together in a world that often refused to accept us? Will my family ever come around? Or had I lost them for good? As I stood on the balcony one evening, watching the sun dip below the horizon, I realized the answers might take time. Maybe years. But for the first time, I felt ready to wait, to fight for a love that was worth it. Months passed, each day a delicate balance between healing and rebuilding. The initial sting of my father's rejection softened over time, though it never fully faded. There were nights when I lay awake, replaying his words in my mind, wondering if there was something, anything I could have done differently to change his mind. But then I'd think of Ezra, of the way he looked at me like I was worth fighting for. And I'd remind myself that some battles aren't meant to be won with compromise. They're fought for truth. Ezra and I grew closer during those months, our bond deepening as we navigated the challenges together. He didn't try to fix me or shield me from the pain. Instead, he stood beside me, offering quiet strength when I needed it most. We found solace in small moments, a shared laugh over breakfast, a walk through the park on crisp autumn mornings, the warmth of his hand in mine as we faced another day in a world that often felt unwelcoming. Those moments became anchors, grounding me when the weight of everything else threatened to pull me under point one evening. As winter settled in with its biting chill, Ezra surprised me with tickets to an art exhibit downtown. "It's not much," he said sheepishly, handing me the envelope, "but I thought it might cheer you up." I opened it to find 2 passes to a photography showcase featuring local artists. My heart swelled, not because of the gesture itself, but because of what it represented, his unwavering effort to remind me that life could still hold beauty, even after loss. The exhibit was held in a converted warehouse, its industrial walls adorned with vibrant images that told stories of resilience, love, and identity. As we wandered through the space, I found myself drawn to one piece in particular, a black and white photograph of 2 figures standing back to back, their silhouettes illuminated by a single beam of light. The caption read, "Finding ourselves in each other." "It's beautiful," I murmured, feeling a lump rise in my throat. Ezra nodded, his gaze soft as he studied the image. "Kind of like us." I turned to look at him, struck by how perfectly the photo captured what we'd become to each other. In him, I found not just love, but a reflection of the person I was learning to embrace, the person I wanted to be. Later that night, as we sat on the couch in my apartment, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot chocolate, I broached a topic I'd been avoiding for weeks. "Do you ever wonder what happens next?" "For us, I mean." Ezra tilted his head, considering the question. "All the time. But I don't need to know every detail to believe it'll work out." "Do you?" I admitted, staring into my mug. "But sometimes it feels like no matter how far we come, there's always going to be something or someone trying to tear us apart." He reached out, taking my hand in his. "That's true. But here's the thing. They can try all they want, but they'll never take away what we've built. What we are. That's ours. No one can touch it unless we let them." His words resonated deeply, settling into the cracks of my doubt like mortar filling broken stone. He was right. We couldn't control the world around us, but we could choose how we responded to it. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough that a few weeks later, I received a letter from my mother. It arrived unexpectedly, tucked among bills and junk mail, its familiar handwriting making my chest tighten before I even opened it. Inside was a simple note, written in her careful script. "Dear protagonist's name, I hope this finds you well. Your father is struggling. He misses you, though he won't admit it. So do I. Please know that no matter what, you are loved. Always. Love, Mom." Tears blurred my vision as I read her words over and over, tracing the loops and curves of her penmanship with trembling fingers. It wasn't forgiveness, not exactly, but it was a start, a bridge, however fragile, reaching across the chasm that had formed between us. When I showed the letter to Ezra, he smiled softly. "See? Progress." "Maybe," I said, folding the paper carefully and tucking it back in the envelope. "But it's going to take time. And that's okay," he replied. "You don't have to rush it." As spring approached, bringing with it longer days and warmer air, I began to notice subtle shifts within myself. The constant ache of rejection lessened, replaced by a quiet determination to live authentically, unapologetically. I started journaling again, something I hadn't done since childhood, pouring my thoughts on a paper without fear of judgment. I reconnected with old friends who accepted me for who I was, expanding my circle beyond the confines of the church community I'd once called home. Most importantly, I stopped waiting for permission to be happy. Instead, I chose joy, not recklessly, but deliberately, knowing full well the risks involved. With Ezra by my side, I learned to see love not as a source of conflict, but as a sanctuary, a place where I could breathe freely without apology. That on a bright Saturday morning, nearly a year after our first meeting at the cafe, Ezra and I returned to the park where it had all begun. The pond shimmered under the sunlight, its surface dotted with ducks gliding lazily across the water. We sat on the same bench where we'd shared so many conversations, watching the world unfold around us in shades of green and gold. You know, Ezra said after a while, his voice tinged with nostalgia, this spot feels kind of magical now. Why's that? I asked, leaning my head against his shoulder. Because it's where everything changed, he replied simply. For both of us. I smiled, closing my eyes as a gentle breeze rustled the leaves above us. In that moment, I realized something profound. Change wasn't something to fear. It was inevitable, yes, but also beautiful, transformative. Like the seasons shifting, like the sun rising after a storm. And as I sat there with Ezra, surrounded by the quiet hum of nature and the steady rhythm of his heartbeat, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known was possible. Not because everything was perfect, but because I finally understood that perfection wasn't the goal. Growth was. Love was.